everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 24th, where I wanted to continue our conversations about Frankenstein. And if you look in the notes below, you'll see, as I had indicated last class, that I'm going to need to cancel a couple classes because I'm going to be out of town. So on Wednesday the 1st and Monday the 6th, class is canceled. I'll be putting a note up on our Moodle site. It would be a wonderful opportunity for you to get ahead with the readings because you've got the entire course outline in front of you that you can reference. It's also a wonderful opportunity to work on the first paper, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But to get back to Frankenstein, we were talking about some of the major elements of the text to consider, and I had indicated that I wanted to circle back to the probably most famous scene in Gothic literature, and that is the creation scene, which is what motivated Mary Shelley in A Nightmare to create the text in the first place. And I just wanted to read to you a little bit the creation scene. This is in the beginning of chapter 5 because it really illustrates the importance of the atmosphere and mood in the Gothic tradition. And it begins with, "It was a dreary night of November when I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Oh, how can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful? Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white socks in which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and his straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, I succeeded, and it goes on, of course, talking a little bit about the horrors of the creature, and that is, as I had indicated, the beginnings of what we see in the great Gothic tradition that has been basically turned into contemporary horror film. And film is so important even in the early days of Gothic because it really is the Hollywood version of Frankenstein that has captured imaginations. And as we discussed, that Hollywood version is quite different than the vision Mary Shelley had. Just in the description alone, we don't have a green creature that has a square head with bolts, hardly. And there are other versions of Frankenstein that are more accurate. There is one that's directed by Kenneth Branagh that stars Robert De Niro as the creature that is more accurate. And I believe I've mentioned more than once that Guillermo del Toro is coming out with a version of Frankenstein that I'm quite excited to see, that has been given some incredibly positive reviews. But nevertheless, as we know, film is always different from text. You never have that sense of intimacy when you're reading, I think, able to be duplicated completely with film. But to move on, talking about Frankenstein, chapter 9, we see how incredibly articulate this creature is. Again, hugely deviating from the Hollywood version of Frankenstein, where the creature just grunts. And again, I prefer to call the creature by the name creature and not monster, because the true monstrosity is Victor for creating something so unnatural. What is natural and unnatural is a major theme in the story. And also by abandoning his responsibility to his creation, almost like a parent abandoning their responsibility to their child. So that said, the theme of what is monstrous and that humanity itself is perhaps the biggest monstrosity is embedded in the text in a way that we don't necessarily see in the Hollywood film, but I can't help but think that even with the 1930s films changes, you've got the Igor servant, his name is Fritz in this particular instance, torturing the creature with fire. So we do have a certain level of empathy for the creature and a certain understanding of the cruelty of humanity, even in the 1930s version. And certainly in the text, we see that this creature is not just articulate, but he appreciates nature. He engages in benevolent activities. He tries to assist the DeLacy family. He teaches himself language. He uses reason. And he compares himself both to Adam and Satan, God's creations that ultimately were at one point or another, as he says, abandoned by God. Now, that said, again, we have to suspend some disbelief that the creature could first find texts in the wilderness and then could teach itself how to read by basically eavesdropping on the DeLacy family, which is trying to teach language to the newest member of the family. And while it's certainly, I suppose, if we suspend disbelief possible that this supernatural being has supernatural ability, the whole point is not whether or not the creature is able to actually engage in these tasks. It's the question of nature versus nurture. And we don't have the abnormal as we see in Young Frankenstein, which is based on abnormal in the 1930s version of Frankenstein brain. But we do have the question of, is one born with a certain temperament for good or evil? Or is that temperament created through environment? In other words, nature versus nurture. And in terms of the creature, it seems to be much more in relation to environment, to the treatment that the creature receives, which I think is also quite applicable to contemporary society. When someone has done something that's socially unacceptable, is that person completely responsible, or has that person been molded by environmental factors? And there's no easy answer to this, just like there's no easy answer to any of the questions that are presented in good pieces of literature, which is why good literature requires us to think and contemplate and debate, which Frankenstein has done, definitely, I think. As I had indicated, it's never been out of print. So the creature then begins by telling us the story of the DeLacy family. Again, none of this is part of the 1930s film, where we have a blind old man from an exiled family. And the idea of vision and sight, because the creature is basically rejected because of its horrific appearance. So the idea is that if he's able to somehow connect with someone who's blind, who can't physically see, then perhaps he will have an opportunity to show his character rather than to show his physical appearance and show his ultimate worth. And of course, we see how that backfires in the way that the creature tries to approach the blind old man, but the rest of his family members come back too soon and they see the creature's horrific appearance, and of course, they panic. And the creature, in frustration and in revenge, goes on basically a killing spree, but not before the creature tries to save a drowning girl, which is something that we saw in the film, though it's portrayed a bit differently in the text that Mary Shelley gives us, the girl is already drowning. The creature isn't playing with the girl. The creature attempts to save the girl from drowning, and the creature is rewarded with gunshots. And after all of that, the creature, when he has the opportunity to get revenge by killing William, Victor's brother, the creature does so, and in fact even learns how to make it seem as if someone else is responsible for the deed. It happens to be Justine, the favorite of the family that I was indicating before, that is looking for William. So basically, what we see is that the creature is learning evil through humanity's actions of evil. And that said, we learn about the DeLacy family, and at one point the creature asks, this is in chapter 13, was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? And the answer is, oh yeah. And we find out through the DeLacy family that basically one of the members of the family had stepped forward to try to help somebody who had experienced injustice from the government. And the consequences of that was that he was betrayed, and ultimately the DeLacy family lost everything and needed to go into exile. And the betrayal, I think, is quite interesting in the sense of the Eurocentric elements within this text. As progressive as Mary Shelley is, talking about issues of otherness and rejection, we learn that Safi's mother, who is introduced into the DeLacy family as the prize, if you will, from the person who has experienced injustice, again illustrating how female is objectified at this particular society, and Mary Shelley is illustrating that in her text. Safi is the prize if Felix and the DeLacy family will help him. Basically, Safi is the beautiful young daughter. And Safi's mother is a Christian Arab and taught Safi to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad in chapter 14. So we very much get a Christian bias and a Eurocentric bias here, and the idea that as much as female is ostracized and rejected in European society, it could be much worse, such as for the female followers of Muhammad. But this is the long, convoluted way to explain why Safi will never be given to Felix as prize, because the father is horrified over the idea that his daughter would be with a Christian, since they are Arab. And that's the way that the DeLacy family is basically experiencing its own level of injustice. The thing is, Safi and Felix have fallen in love, and Safi makes it her mission to leave home and to find Felix and the family. If we're going to see any strong females in this text, this is it. Safi doesn't know the language, she doesn't know the geography, and yet she goes out to pursue her true love. So her story is minuscule compared to the creature, because that's what Mary Shelley wants us to focus on, Victor and the creature, but I've always found Safi to be a fascinating character. And when Safi does find the family successfully, she doesn't speak English, so the family has to teach her how to speak, read, and write English. And coincidentally, this allows the creature who is watching the family to learn English as well. Again, we have to suspend some disbelief here, perhaps. And how does the creature know its own origin story? We're told this in chapter 15, that after the creature arrived to its hovel, it discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress that the creature had taken from Victor's lap. And notice this theme throughout the book, the learning of information through letters. We know that our narrator ultimately is one, who is Walton. All of the information we're getting is through Walton. That's the frame of the story, which is easy to forget, because as we get the story, we're told the story in the eye as if it was happening to that particular individual. But even the creature, and we had talked about some of the difficulties with narration. How much can we trust an epistolary novel that basically is told from one narrator who is in a very poor physical and emotional state? And even if we can trust the narrator, how much can we trust the person who is talking to the narrator, who is Victor, who is also in a very poor physical and emotional state? And how much can we trust a creature who's telling his story to Victor, who's telling his story to Walton? How's that for embedded narratives? When the creature, too, is also experiencing physical and emotional challenges. But nevertheless, the idea of the creature learning through letters is very similar to our learning through letters. And Victor in chapter 19 says, and he oftentimes will say something like this: I felt as if I committed some great crime, but I was guiltless. I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head. He's talking about Justine at this particular point in time, because Victor is well aware that the murderer of William is probably the creature who is seeking out revenge, and not Justine. But but Victor never steps forward, showing a certain level of cowardice, and he justifies this by saying that he would never be believed. But when he says that he feels as if he had committed some great crime, Victor's committed lots of crimes. He created life from death. He's usurped the natural order. He's created life without female. That also usurps the natural order. And he has completely abandoned his responsibility to his creation. So the creature has what seems to be a reasonable request to Victor, as the creature seeks out Victor and says that ultimately Victor can atone by creating the creature a female companion, which seems to make sense because the creature talks about his sense of isolation and his sense of loneliness. However, note that the creature wants a female. Again, the idea of objectifying the female is created for the benefit of the male. And Victor ultimately says that he will do it, and then he negates on that promise, which leads to the creature becoming so infuriated that the creature is going to seek revenge. The best way to seek revenge on somebody is not to seek revenge against them, but to seek revenge against the people that they love. And that's exactly what happens. The creature even tells Victor, I shall be with you on your wedding night. Because if you'll remember, and this is one of the sub-stories, is that Victor is supposed to be engaged to Elizabeth, who is raised as basically his sister. I know that might seem a little bit odd, that particular relationship there. And it was not uncommon, though, for, let's say, cousins to marry. More on this when we get to Edgar Allan Poe. And certainly Victor and Elizabeth are not blood related. We know that she is adopted into the family, so that wouldn't be an issue. But Victor keeps postponing this relationship with Elizabeth, and we can speculate why. The idea of putting his work first and his personal life second has been one of the ways this text has been written, or has been evaluated in terms of how it was written, that perhaps it was a commentary on that. It could also be a commentary on the idea of Victor not necessarily wanting to be with Elizabeth, but perhaps preferring Clerval, his best friend. The way he speaks about Clerval seems almost erotic. In fact, some people have suggested that there are homoerotic elements within the text. I don't know if I'd necessarily go that far, but I did want to mention it, that his connection with Clerval seems to be a lot stronger than the connection that he has with Elizabeth. Ultimately, Victor does marry Elizabeth, and the creature says that I shall be with you in your wedding night. And Victor, who is so arrogant and so self-centered and such a narcissist, assumes that means that the creature is going to go after Victor. And of course, the creature, being so intelligent, realizing the best way to enact revenge is not on the person, but on the loved one of the person, kills Elizabeth, and then goes on a killing spree. And we can't justify the creature's actions, but we also can perhaps understand after the creature has been continually rejected over and over again. There will be the murder of Clerval, and that murder seems to hit Victor even harder. And then eventually what we end up with, and notice how effeminate Victor is portrayed. He's oftentimes fainting and swooning, but eventually we return to our story where Victor is telling Walton about what's happening. And what I think is fascinating is in chapter 24, when we return to the Walton story, Victor says to Walton's mutinous crew, because at this point the crew is ready to mutiny because it seems that they're on a death journey, that there isn't any way for them to successfully find this forbidden passage or the secret passage that Walton is seeking. And again, note the parallels between Walton and Victor, seeking unknown knowledge, even forbidden knowledge. Victor says to Walton's mutinous crew, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. This from Victor at the beginning of the story, where basically he told Walton that he wanted to give Walton this cautionary tale so that Walton does not make the same mistakes as Victor. And now Victor is basically encouraging the crew to continue on this death mission, in effect, rather than to stop their mission, which I think says a lot about Victor, that he has learned a lesson, but only up until a point. The real lesson is for us as reader, hopefully, that we will be able to incorporate the messages of the dangers of hubris and doing unnatural acts. Walton eventually does decide to turn around. If there's any kind of happy ending in the story, it'll be through Walton. Certainly not Victor. What we end up in seeing is Victor's death, which is very different from the 1930s version, where we get the, quote, happy ending, in the sense that the creature is killed and that Victor, with the name Henry, I know it's confusing, though we had talked about the idea of the 1930s when the film came out, Victor being such a German-sounding name, perhaps that not being the best name for a lead in a Hollywood film, which might explain the name change. But again, it leads to a whole host of confusions if you are familiar with the text. And the reality is that Hollywood audiences probably hadn't read the text, which I think is a pity, because as we've talked about, the text has much more depth and much more sophistication than the film. That's not to negate the importance of the film and the Gothic tradition, or to talk about the importance of the film in cinematic studies. But it is a different kind of story. I oftentimes think of the film as a separate story from the actual text itself. But Victor dies, and the creature says he's going to commit suicide in Mary Shelley's text. This is in chapter 24, where the creature says, impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey. And the idea of servitude and mastery, and about being able to control passion, about avoiding the extremes, which might be one of the reasons why we get the extremes of weather in this text, of ice and fire, which you might have noticed when you were reading. And again, these long romantic passages, or at least passages that are written in the romantic tradition of the celebration of nature and the natural world, but also thematically significant, I think, because nature is feminine, or usually portrayed as feminine. And when Victor and the creature surround themselves with the natural world, they have a much better experience than when they isolate themselves. So the creature, because the creature says at this point, now that Victor is gone, he no longer has any reason to live. The only reason at this point he was living for was for vengeance. And again, what an interesting parallel this would be with a troubled parent-child relationship, where you try to escape one another yet are inextricably tied together. And the creature says, I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. The ending is open enough so that ultimately we could have a sequel, I suppose. We don't see the creature killing itself, and we do see Walton turning back, so perhaps he's learned something, and perhaps we've learned something, which was probably the reason for Mary Shelley creating this text. But As we know, it was initially created because of a ghost story competition. So I have a very brief video for you to see. If you look in the notes below at the bottom of the first section, you will see the 200-year anniversary video from USC that talks a little bit about Frankenstein. It's only 1 minute and 51 seconds long, but I'd like you to watch it because I think it gives you a little bit of a way of thinking about the importance of this text in the Gothic tradition that we've talked about, but also with the visuals that are so Gothic that they're going to offer you. I think it just reinforces that idea. And obviously, we could spend an entire semester talking about Frankenstein or any of these texts, but you know that what we've got is an overview of some of the major texts in the Gothic tradition, and I try to put them in chronological order so that we could see a certain level of progression, which would mean that we would move to Edgar Allan Poe, who is known for his short stories. Now, short stories are a bit different than novels. Obviously, they are, well, for lack of a better word, short. Usually they talk about a single incident, and they usually have a twist at the end. And Lovecraft, remember him when we had talked about supernatural horror in literature, had identified Poe as perhaps the greatest Gothic author outside of course, Lovecraft himself. I suspect that's what he thought of himself. And that Poe was a vivid and detached chronicler, Lovecraft says, of strangeness and the gloom of human mind. And the emphasis on psychology. That's not to say that we can't use psychology with Frankenstein, but definitely Poe's texts are very psychological. The endings are ambiguous enough, so it could be a supernatural element that's responsible, or it could be a psychological element that's responsible, or how I like to think of Poe, both are possible at the same time. And Poe's ability for the short stories' maintenance of a single mood or impression is definitely illustrated in the short stories that we will be talking about. And perhaps Poe's most famous work that we won't be talking about, The Raven, and it basically made Poe popular because he had struggled prior to The Raven. We do know that Poe wrote in different kinds of genres. He oftentimes is credited with creating the modern day detective story in the way we think of it. But we usually think about him in terms of supernatural horror, and we think about him in terms of psychological horror, and The Raven is a wonderful example of that. And Lovecraft would argue that Poe is responsible for the modern horror story in its final perfected state. So part of this is our reading a little bit of Poe to determine whether or not we agree or disagree with that. And in terms of Poe's biography, which is nothing short of fascinating, he struggled with drug and alcohol issues, and definitely you can see that in his short stories and also in his famous poem, The Raven. He married his 13-year-old cousin. As I was indicating earlier, that it was not uncommon for individuals to marry cousins, particularly if they were trying to keep birthright, or they were trying to keep estates within families. He had a great fear of being buried alive, which was a legitimate fear for the time because science wasn't as advanced as it is today. So much so that there were even devices that were sold to grieving family members in the event that their loved one had been buried prematurely. For instance, a bell that could be tied to the corpse, let's say the toe, and that string would go from the toe to ultimately above ground with a bell. So if the person had been buried prematurely, if they moved, well, then obviously that would ring the bell, and that would alert the family that if the bell was ringing, then the corpse really wasn't dead. Even today in 2025, there are odd stories about corpses that come alive in the sense that it was thought that they were dead, but really they weren't. So at the time of Poe, tuberculosis was a major element in the deaths that occurred at the time, and many of the symptoms of tuberculosis mimicked what we think of in terms of the symptoms of vampirism, which will get us to Dracula when we get to that particular point. But even now, if you think about some of the zombie lore of Haiti, which actually has legitimate medical reasons, the zombie probably was cemented into popular culture with George Romero, with films like Night of the Living Dead, that this is a dead corpse that for one reason or another has been reanimated. But the early folklore associated with zombie was from a Haitian tradition that through spirituality and also through medical intervention, an individual could be made to seem dead, that their body functions would cease or at least be so mild that they would be undetectable. So through voodoo, and also which was the and is the religion of Haiti, and also, or a religion of Haiti, I should say. And voodoo is a mix of religions, actually. But through that, and it's thought that it's the venom of the pufferfish that was used to inject an individual and ultimately, or to one way or another, drug an individual so that eventually it would appear that they were dead, they would be buried, and then they would be dug up, and that would be the Haitian idea of the zombie. And this person, obviously suffering psychological trauma, obviously suffering physical trauma, would have very little memory of their previous life, and could be set to work and used as a kind of slave. But I digress, because we go not necessarily into zombies in this class, but we do go into the fear of being buried alive in this class. And that gets us back to the very beginnings of the semester. What do you fear? And I can imagine that the fear of being buried alive, particularly when that was not necessarily uncommon at the time, would be a legitimate fear. But of course, it's also wonderfully symbolic. And as we talked about with the Gothic tradition, the literal is oftentimes used as a springboard for the symbolic. And the fear of the unknown is probably, in one way or another, the impetus for all of those fears. But talking about Poe's biography, I have a short biography that I'm going to ask you to watch. It's only 3 minutes and 49 seconds. You can see this in the third section in the notes below, so that'll tell you a little bit about Poe. And then you can see in the fourth section the 4 short stories that we're going to be reading. I have provided the links for where you can find those stories, but I also ordered a text for the class of Poe's short stories that should include all of these. The Fall of the House of Usher, Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. And those are the pieces that we're going to be talking about next class, as well as talking a little bit more about the paper. Now, if you remember, I had distributed paper topics earlier, and you can find those in the syllabus and other documents folder. And I had asked you to consider Emily Dickinson's quote, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted," for the topic of your paper. But you can create your own paper topic as long as it's based on one of the texts that we are talking about in class, and you get the topic approved by me. And since I am going to be gone for a week, this would be a wonderful opportunity for you to think about what you might want to write a paper about. It could be Frankenstein, where we are basically headed towards putting some closure, at least in our class discussions on Frankenstein. Perhaps it's on Poe. It could be that you focus on one of the 4 short stories we're reading. Perhaps you compare and contrast 2 of the short stories that we're reading. Perhaps you want to talk about Poe in a more general way. I usually caution students not to talk about more than 2 or 3 short stories at the same time. Certainly you can reference all 4, but you probably want to focus on 1 or 2 because it's only a 4 or 5 page paper. But I understand that 4 to 5 pages sounds like it is a good amount of work, and it is a good amount of work, but it's not a 14 or 15 page paper. So the idea is that you have some focus, whether you're writing about Frankenstein or you're writing about Edgar Allan Poe, or the text after that is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And also the week that I'm gone would be a wonderful time for you to read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a novella. So it's longer than Poe's short stories, but it's not as long as a novel like Frankenstein. It's someplace in between. And by the time we're done with Jekyll and Hyde, that's around the time that I was indicating the paper would be submitted in, hopefully, though I have rolling deadlines. You can certainly hand in your paper early, and you can certainly hand in your paper after that deadline, but I chose that because it was approximately midway through the semester. So if you don't have a paper by that point, you want to keep me updated as to what the status is. But think about at this point what you might want to do a paper about. And next class, in addition to talking about Poe, I wanted to talk about some of the conventions of writing a paper, which I suspect will be review since you have taken a Comp 2 class at this point. But again, I wanted just to talk about some basic elements as well. So what's left for today is talking about our discussion forum question, which would be due on which would be due on Friday, the 26th. Of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to. But you are required to read all of your peers' responses and my responses in turn. It'll give you a good idea of the kind of class conversation we could have had in a face-to-face situation. And I wanted to circle back to the narration of Frankenstein for this question about the use of the epistolary novel technique, which has strengths and weaknesses associated with it, pros and cons. So, do you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique? Because by this point, I'm hopeful that you would have finished reading Frankenstein in its entirety. So you would be able to speak to whether or not you like or dislike the technique. And of course, more importantly, why? And as you can see, there is no right or wrong answer to this question. It's an opinion piece because I'm really more interested in your reasoning and your thinking than anything else. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, put some closure onto Frankenstein, talk about writing papers, and begin to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. Take care. Bye-bye.